My name is Lauren. I'm an MLIS grad student and the Student Advocacy President at San Jose State University. I, like many other students, have been watching the world respond to the issue that severely impacts the industry that many students like myself are hoping to enter. Admittedly, it looks pretty bleak. That's why I decided to put out a call to get the perspective of real-life experienced librarians today, to hear their side of the story. Even though
an angry guy called me, but it was really funny.
Full voice. I'm like, I thought it was the same thing.
Not a single person.
Yeah, exactly. This is good. This is a good time to graduate now. Yeah, that's so cool. Well, thanks for letting me know.
What I say is, have them read the book.
In this episode, we talked to Kate, a high school teacher librarian in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not going to lie to you, this episode does have some heavier themes, so just keep an eye out for the content warnings I've attached here. I've tried to add some timestamps as well for some of the more harsher topics, but I think they're important. Alright, let's get into it. Yeah, it's been, as you can imagine, an interesting experience talking to various people who have had somewhat similar experiences with what's going on currently with book bans and such. So what has been your experience, since you're saying you're in a school environment? How has that affected you and the area you're in, just generally or recently?
Before this past year, I have never really had too much. I had one or two parents come in and we talked about a book that they didn't think was going to be on the shelf, but I kept it on the shelf. They left fairly satisfied and there wasn't any issue. This year, I don't remember exactly when it started, but I know in October, a woman came to our school board, and in the school board meeting, she actually said that I Am Jazz, the elementary book, about a young transgender girl and it talks about how she realized when she was quite young that she was a girl and not a boy, and her parents were supportive of this and let her become basically a girl. Not physically, they didn't have her change, but she, for all outward appearances, became a girl. And basically it just talks about how she, feels she was a girl, and so she wanted to dress like and be a girl, and they wanted that to be removed from the elementary schools it was in. There was a poster that they found in one of our middle schools that just had this kind of picture, but it was just kind of a generic picture. It wasn't anything, it was just a colorful thing in the background. And then it had all the LGBTQ terms with definitions. And that's all the sign had. They wanted that removed. They felt it was inappropriate to have that in a middle school. Yes, they felt that was definitions. I mean, we're talking just things like, homosexual. It's when, a man is attracted to a man or a woman's attracted to a woman. It was just that, okay? I was looking at that thinking, are you kidding me? And then for high school, they asked about genderqueer, and they wanted genderqueer to be removed. A little bit after that, they contacted the district and asked the district if any of the schools had genderqueer. I happened to be the only school in the district with the book in my library. And shortly after they were told about that, a lady from their group wrote the superintendent asking him to fire me, have me arrested, and make a public apology for having this book in my library. He talked to me about it. We decided that there would potentially be more emails. So we've created a generic response that I was to send to everybody, explaining that we would hold a meeting that they could talk to me about this. So I started doing that. And I received about 35 emails during that time period. Most of them were quite nasty. I was called a pervert. I was called a pedophile. I was called a groomer, called immoral, and lots of bad things. Nothing really super threatening, but there was a mild threat. They had set up these two meetings, and by the time the meetings came, I'd received 35 emails about the book, and then I'd received more emails asking if they could attend the meeting. I'd received a total of about 60 emails at that point in time, and I was afraid to go to the meeting because I thought there would be so many people. I knew they would probably take my picture that would be scattered throughout town. It just scared me. So I told them I was afraid to go. And the superintendent said it'd be a dereliction of duty if I refused to attend, because I had obviously intended to attend. And I said, I can take sick leave. He said, you can't not be sick and take sick leave. And I said, I can tell you something right now. Knowing that I would be going into school the next day with 60 people there who could potentially, harm me, would make me physically ill. Trust me, I would have a headache, I would have stomach problems, and mentally I would be totally So I said, you literally cannot say that I wouldn't be sick. And my principal, interestingly, very, very, very conservative Mormon who thought the book was totally inappropriate, totally disgusting. You cannot believe the negative things you said about the book in the meeting where they had the challenge meeting. He said, Kate, I understand how you feel. I've seen the letters that you've received. I understand how you feel. If you give me a statement, I'll be sure to read it exactly as you write it. He said, we will do that instead. And the superintendent did agree to that. We had the meeting and I didn't attend. We had 2 meetings actually, and 18 people total attended one of the 2 meetings. So it wasn't as many as we thought. It was interesting, of the 60 people, most of them didn't live in our district. They had to show an ID to come into the meeting. And if it had an address that was outside our district, they wouldn't let them in. Because they said, this is only for the district community. Only 3 of them had children and none of the children were at my school. So there wasn't a single person that was impacted directly by me having the book in my life. Can you believe that? Not a single person. That was very, very startling. Fortunately, my district, even though my superintendent and my principal and everybody was pretty much opposed to me doing this, the protocol in our district for book banning or for book challenges is that the book stays on the shelf throughout the entire process. I told them I wasn't going to remove the book. At the end of the meeting, I was told that I had to listen to someone to read the whole minutes of the meeting aloud to me so that the people would know that I had actually heard the entire contents of the meeting. They chose my evaluator, the person who who determines my work ethic and my value to the school. And that was terrifying because I knew I was going to say no to her and I didn't know her feelings about it. She read all the minutes and at the very end she said, now, Kate, after hearing all of that, how do you feel now about keeping the book in the library? I knew exactly what she was saying. Aren't you going to take it out? You've heard all this. Aren't you going to take it out? And I thought, no, I'm not going to take it out. I said, no, I'm planning on keeping it in the library. I try to be really friendly. And I said, I think that's the best thing. If the people take it to the district, then the district, if they decide to take it out of the library, then the district can make that decision. But I don't plan on it. Then she had highlighted some of the comments. She read a comment. And then at the end of that comment, she said, now, after hearing that, Kate, and she did that like 5 or 6 times. And I finally said, you do realize that what you're doing is counterproductive. I said, every time you read one of those, it makes me realize even more why I need to keep this book in the library. It shows me that our kids need this. If these people are going to attack like this, our kids really need this kind of support. That's what you're not seeing. And I said, and I thought, this wasn't a poorly chosen book. I used the district criteria for selecting the book. The book has a solid credentials. I don't see why you're being so difficult. That was really frustrating. That was really, really frustrating. So she finally stopped talking and we just kept the book in the library. They did take it to the district. I knew that there were several members of the district who would support it because they'd helped me with my response for the district. I'd had some strong support from specific members of the committee that I knew was going to look at it. So we talked to them and they decided to kind of make sure that there would be a way that they could potentially keep it in my library. It received much greater support than I thought it would. Something that was startling in the meeting, there was a man who spoke in the meeting who looked like he had just stepped out of the military. He spoke right after my principal and another man from the district who both totally disparaged the book, said extremely negative things about it. And he began his speech saying, sometimes you have to take a stand. And I thought, oh crap, he's going to want the book out of the library. And he said, we need to tell these people no. We need to let these people know that we are going to take control of our library. He said, I don't even know why we're having this meeting. He said, I don't like this book, but Kate has every right to have it in her library. I had thought for sure this man was going to vote against keeping the book in the library, and he voted to keep it in the library. I thought he was going to be one of my no votes. I was so impressed with the fact that he realized that there would be things in a library that he would not necessarily like. That really touched me to see this person like my own family say that he understood what libraries were. That was just beautiful. But we did, and we had some really nice conversation by some of the people who spoke, who talked about how important it was and how these students who were going to react, and who needed this book were oftentimes extremely depressed, potentially suicidal, and how books like this could change their lives, could change the situation for them. And so they did vote 10-2 to keep the book in my library. So it is still in my library. The superintendent still, I think, was frustrated. And he said, since we didn't meet the exact challenge protocol because you didn't go to the meeting, I think we need to take it to the school board I thought, oh, crud, and he can really impact the school board. And not only that, this occurred during our levy vote. And the people opposing the levy vote were saying that one of the reasons not to vote for the levy was because the schools had access to pornography in their libraries for our students. And it said that on all of the little posters all through town that that public schools had pornography in their libraries. Okay. Which was really frustrating. So this occurred during the time I was doing the challenge. And the district, of course, was afraid that that would potentially change the vote. Fortunately, when they voted by an 18-point margin, they won the levy. It was 59-41. It was a slight decrease from what we'd had in the past. We've always had over 60%, but it wasn't very much. And because of the pandemic and everything like that, we didn't feel that that was necessarily the reason that there was a change in the vote. But it easily passed over 50%, so there was no issue with it. I had thought that would calm things down, but the superintendent still wanted to make sure that one felt good about the protocol. So he said that the school board had to vote to maintain the book before he would let it pass through. And they voted unanimously. I don't know what he thought was going to happen, but they voted unanimously to keep the book in my library, which was extremely positive for me. Our school board president was a former student of mine, and I knew she would support the book. And so I was hoping that she would have enough persuasion over the other members to at least get a majority vote, but it was unanimous. So that was a very positive thing in my book. And so basically, that's kind of my story of what happened. There were things that were really positive. The majority of the teachers at my school supported me. We have this little thing where we pass around a duck, and it's a stone duck, and we dress him up according to things that we feel that this duck needs to learn while he stays with us. They gave the duck to me because they felt that the duck needed to be in an open and friendly environment. When I received the duck, literally at least 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the staff cheered me on and told me what a wonderful job I was doing, much to the chagrin of principal who was there. But it was a very positive experience. It was a very positive experience. And I talked to teachers, and one of my friends who's a teacher who's gay had her friends write me emails to cheer me up. Another teacher, actually a Mormon from Provo, Utah, brought me chocolate chip cookies to make me feel good about myself and supported the book. A bookstore where I buy books, because I want to buy locally. They give me a 25% discount, and it's a local bookstore. It's like win, win, win. Anyway, so I go up there, and the lady said, one of our staff members heard Maya Kobe speak, and she went up to them, and they signed a book for you, and we'd like to present you with a signed copy of the book so you can remember this experience. I couldn't believe how thoughtful and kind people were. Some of the takeaways that I had, in fact, one of the major takeaways was my youngest is a transgender woman, and she's just turned 40 this year. It all of a sudden dawned on me as I was reading all these emails what it actually feels like to be treated this way. And I knew as I was getting these emails that it would end. But it dawned on me, for my daughter, for my students, for my teachers, for everyone in the LGBT community, this won't end until we make it end. And that was something that really touched me. And I'd known that it was awful. I'd known that it was difficult, but I'd never, ever personally experienced it. And to personally experience those feelings was extremely empowering, both empowering for what I was doing, but also really increased my empathy. Because all of a sudden I had a real experience. I had an authentic experience of what they were going through. And that was really, really meaningful to me. And although I wish this hadn't happened, although I wish that this never would happen, I am grateful that I did have that happen to me if it had to, because it really strengthened my resolve in protecting and taking care of these students at my school and making sure that their lives were positive. Because I had, you don't have an idea exactly how it feels until it actually happens to you. Twice when I was driving home, I worried that someone was following me. I made repeated left turns. My daughter said, make a bunch of left turns, because she said left turns are hard to do, and see if they continue. And it appeared 2 times, the same car both times was following me home. And my daughter said, Mom, you passed by a Starbucks, a Black Rock, and Taco Bell, and Wendy's. She said, go to each one of them and buy some little item. And she said, they won't follow you through 4 different places. So that's what I did. And sure enough, when I drove by, and it was fairly obvious vehicle, that's another reason, because it was the vehicle was so obvious and it was following me. But when I got out of the parking lot, the vehicle was nowhere around. And so I drove home. And then, like my daughter said, when you get home, Mom, you'll have a treat. My other daughter, she is a combat helicopter pilot.
Whoa.
And she is right now the safety officer on her post. And so she said, Mom, that's what I would tell people here. But because of all of this, I did really feel, I think, some of the feelings that some people feel when they feel targeted, when they feel marginalized, extremely marginalized. And I felt that that was a really powerful lesson for me and a powerful thing for me to be aware of. And to realize that some of my neighbors, because I live in a fairly conservative neighborhood, I moved there intentionally because I think liberals need to live in conservative areas, because if we don't have any liberals, my area as a whole is fairly liberal, but we've always had a Republican representative in Congress until recently. And because of that, I like living in a neighborhood where I feel like I can maybe show that there are good people who are liberal, and that there are considerate people who are liberal. And I try to help my neighbors. I try to do nice things for my neighbors. I try to be a really good neighbor so they see that kind of warmth and empathy from a person who is not like them. Because I think the more you're around people, I've lived abroad three times. I've lived in Japan for about 2.5 years total. I'm not with the military. I've lived actually in Japan. I taught in Japan, and I went on a mission for my church to Japan. And then I got a Fulbright scholarship to do research in England for 6 months. And I lived in Sheffield, England, and did research on engaging immigrant and at-risk students in the research process. I worked with a group of kids who were some Roma Slovakians, and also a group of kids from the Middle East that I worked with. And that was a really, really fun experience. They only let me come to the school 8 times, but during those 8 times, I got to know a couple of those kids really, really well. And that was very, very fun experience. Living in England was wonderful. I think when you've lived abroad, especially when you work with populations that are marginalized, you have a much better understanding of what life is like. Living in Japan as a teacher, I taught English for a year, and my daughter, my youngest, attended a public school, really helped me understand what it's like to be really in the minority. I was the only teacher at my school who wasn't Japanese. My daughter was the only student at her school who wasn't Japanese. That was a very interesting experience. And then in England, working with students who were very marginalized by society in England. And then my own school where I work here, more than 50% of the students go home to speak a language that is not English. So I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is, but it's over 50% do not have a primary language of English. And over 75% are on free and reduced lunch. I probably have the most qualifications and most experience in my district, and probably could work at any school, be able to have my choice of jobs. I want to work at this school. And the reason is because these are the students I feel that I can relate to the best, and I feel I can help the most. I love this population. I love working at this school. I would never consider we have 2 white flight schools. I would never consider going to either of the white flight schools. And we do have another school similar to mine, but I think mine is even more, it's a more critical place to work. And because of that, I've tried to make sure my library reflects that. When you have a really diverse, and a lot of our students who are marginalized, looking and making sure their needs are met is really critical. I feel that has helped keep me younger, because I'm continually having to stretch myself to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can for the student population that I work with. And I feel that I have a really positive experience with my English teachers who are very supportive of what I'm doing. We did decide, and this is something I think school districts need to consider, hopefully prior to getting one of the challenges like these. These challenges are so different than challenges in the past. In the past, all of my challenges were just a parent would come in and say, hey, why do you have this book in the library? I'd talk to him about it, say, well, tell your kid not to read it, They'd leave, I'd put it back on the shelf. We were done. And now all of a sudden, it was a concerted target with a lot of people and a large audience that was telling us to take this off the shelf. So it was a very different feel to it. And I think that we had a fairly solid protocol in place, but it did say that the person had to discuss with the group. We now have put it that it should be in writing. So if someone emailed me, now I can respond in writing, and that will meet the protocol. But before, we didn't have that. Another thing is, we talked about how if one of us was challenged, immediately let us all know that they'd been challenged in case someone else had the book and was potentially challenged also. That way there would be multiple librarians facing a challenge instead of one librarian. When I did it, I was the only person that had the book in the library. So I was the only person who was defending the book. And also we decided that hopefully another librarian would be willing to add the book to their library. So if there's another challenge and only one librarian has it, for example, they did actually give us a list of books they wanted to have removed from the library. And one of the books, I was the only librarian that had one of those books, and I had an extra copy. So I gave it to another library. So now it's in 2 libraries. So that means there's 2 of us who are standing fast with that. So it means there's more of us against the community that's doing this. They are aligning themselves and putting themselves in a situation. Librarians need to align themselves and put themselves in a situation where they are solidly moving forward, saying, this is how we are going to proceed. These are the things we are going to do. Sending out the same message to everybody every time. Have the same message. This is our library collection development policy in the district. I followed this policy. That's why this book is in the library. Your child doesn't need to select this book, but it is going to stay in the library. And it's the same message every time, same wording, same everything. This is saying to this group, we have decided that we as a group are going to solidly support whatever librarian has these books in their library. And I think that's something that I hope other librarians in other school districts are looking at to ensure that it's a solid group of people as opposed to just one librarian facing it. I don't want any of the librarians in my district to face exactly what I face. We shouldn't have to anymore because we know it's a potential that that will happen again. So if people are in a situation where they suspect that, or where they see like we saw in advance, but we still didn't know that a book was going to be challenged. We just knew that people were making comments to the school board. We hadn't really considered formal challenge like we received. And now that we have received that, we know that that's a potential. And I think that to me is a big message to school librarians, is that the school librarians need to band together. Also, I did not actually talk with the public library till after things were over, because my library situation, I don't know if they have tried to ban books, but when I talked to the director of our library, she told me that their main focus right now was trying to maintain drag queen story time. And that drag queen story time had been very popular and they didn't want to remove it, but this group was actually targeting drag queen story. I knew that that was happening, and I knew that that was something that they were dealing with while I was dealing with this. Because it was a different issue and it was something that was stressful for them, I felt that it was inappropriate maybe for me to try to, I couldn't support them very well and they couldn't support me because it was kind of a different situation. But then when we both succeeded, it was kind of nice to to talk about our success and to talk about how we still do have drag queen story time and we still do have genderqueer in my library. In fact, I have a very solid LGBT collection. I have it in a really nice display for my students so that it's very obvious for them and they can come and whenever they want to. I had 2 young women come in at the end of last year and said, "This is so cool." And she turned to her friend and she said, "Look how much fun we're going to have." I don't know how that touched me. It made me feel so good that these 2 young ladies had realized that this was there for them and they could spread it around to their friends. With genderqueer, when the word came out, 2 or 3 students came and asked to check the book out. It made it much more popular in my library, and several teachers asked to check it out. I now have 3 copies of it in my library because it became that popular. I don't think that books should become popular because of banning, but it is one of the positive residual effects from that. Probably they consider it collateral damage. I consider it collateral positive. It's a positive thing.
That's cool that you have to link with other librarians in your district, because I know sometimes the representation of librarians in the districts can be pretty lacking. So one of the other advocacy projects I'm working on is about getting a school library lead, which would hopefully help ensure that California districts have to instate a teacher librarian, because it's been basically a suggestion. We're like the worst on the 50 states of student to teacher librarian ratio, actually.
There are studies that show, you're probably aware of them, that there are some really solid studies that show a certified librarian does increase test scores, increases graduation percentages and things like that. I'm in a blessed district. Every single school in my district that is of any size has a full-time librarian. Schools that are under like a population of 250 may only have a half-time librarian, but all of the schools of anything over 250 students has a full-time librarian. And
Okay.
we feel very blessed. The district at one point in time tried to put half-time librarians in the smaller elementary schools. Parents in the community were furious and went to the
Wow.
school district, and they said, we will withhold levy funds if you do this. Our neighboring school district did something that kind of surprised me, but they did not pass their initial levy, and the levy that they passed ended up giving them less money because they had to
Mm.
lower the percentage rate to get it to pass. So they decided to eliminate all secondary librarians. They maintained elementary librarians, but got rid of their secondary librarians, which surprised me. I believe there were two reasons for that. One, they use those librarians for prep time. When teachers have their prep, school districts oftentimes for the elementary schools have some sort of activity that the students go to, so the teacher has that time to themselves. And library time is usually one of those times. My district does not use that as a prep time. We have dance, music, and art. And those are our three prep time go-tos for our elementary students. And so they were reluctant to remove that, the librarian, because they couldn't have a clerk do that. The other thing that I think that they were thinking about, and this to me, I actually do think that the elementary librarians are the more essential librarians, because that is when students are learning to love to read, particularly in marginalized situations. When you have a librarian who's going to read on a regular basis to students who might never have been read to before, I think that's a really positive experience. I worked for 2 years at a very poor elementary school. It was a Title I school. And so when I was working for that, I found out that many of these children had never been read to. Many of them were totally unfamiliar with books. They were totally unfamiliar. And it was very interesting to read to little kids who, and with kindergartners, sometimes I'd have one sit on my lap well, I'd read. It was really a fun experience. I enjoyed it a lot, but I wanted to be a high school librarian. But it was a very fun experience because these kids were so receptive to being read to talking about the books. Everybody said, oh, isn't it difficult? Aren't they difficult? No, when you read to these kids and you ask them questions and you talk about it, and then after we read about a specific thing, well, now where can we find books like that in the library? So I'd take them to that little part of the library, and then that whole section would be checked out within a couple of periods because those were the books
Oh,
that we were talking about. So it was very engaging. So I do feel that actually, although I think it's important because research and maintaining that kind of reader engagement is important, to me, getting kids into books to begin with is a critical element to helping our students ensure that they start off well. So it saddens me when a lot of school districts, my sister was a teacher in California for years, and her school did not have a librarian. And the clerk one year, actually, they gave the clerk one year a bunch of money, and she actually bought textbooks and put textbooks in the library because it was good material. And my sister said, but the kids don't want to read that. So
yeah.
something, this is kind of off topic, but something funny that happened in my district. I was on the team that was helping to decide the evaluation for librarians. And they said, oh, and one thing we want to make sure is that the librarians buy quality books. And and I raised my hand, and you'll know what kind of person I am from this. I raised my hand and I said, well, actually, I buy quite a bit of crap for my library. And and they looked at me and it was like, how can you even say that? And so I looked at the elementary librarians and I said, okay, who has Pokemon in their library? Who has, there are these Mary Kate and Ashley books about, the Mary
Yeah.
Kate that were
Yeah.
anyway. I said, who has Mary Kate and Ashley books? And then I turned to the middle school librarians. I said, okay, who has Dork Diaries? Who has Naruto? And I said, and I'm looking at myself and I have all this manga. I said, my kids devour it. The lady who was in charge, who was the most startled, noticed that a principal had raised her hand. And she said to the principal, because she thought the principal was going to bail her out. And the principal turned to me and she said, you know exactly what our kids need. She said, she's totally right. And the woman from district was like, no, that's not what the principal is supposed to say. This is a woman who, when you ask her a question, asks you a question because she always thinks she can teach you. So she turns to me and she says, well, then what should we say, Kate? Because she didn't think I had an answer for her. And I smiled and I said, engaging and age appropriate. And that's what we put in the thing, that librarians purchase books for their students that are engaging and age appropriate instead of quality books. Because what is a quality book to begin with?
Right.
What does
Right.
quality actually mean? Is Twilight quality?
Yeah,
It's,
I mean, I was a big reader in high school, but I remember being embarrassed about reading age-appropriate teen books when I was a teenager because of some of the attitudes around them. And it's like, that's the time you're supposed to read them. What are you talking like? It's Oh, you can read them anytime, but just people act interestingly about that.
And that has been something that's been frustrating. I'm glad you brought that up. And I enjoy some young adult. I
Yeah.
read young adult novels myself, but I'm in my 70s because number one, I want to be aware of what's going on in the novel with my kids. And number two, I have fun reading them. The
Yeah.
Hate You Give, I thought The Hate You Give was absolutely fabulous. That's one of my favorite reads. And I just finished a book called Patron Saints of Nothing, which took place in the Philippines, and it was a young adult book. And I loved the book. I loved the author. The author was a fabulous writer. So I do think that engaging kids in reading is something that the librarian does. The library is not meant specifically for academic purposes. It's meant to pull kids into something that will become a lifelong passion. And I think that's an important aspect of school. And when kids read, and it doesn't matter what they read, they do increase their intelligence. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's Pokemon. It doesn't matter if it's Dork Diaries. Those things are going to change our students. And something I have really noticed, when kids read lots and lots of manga, almost invariably, they start reading fantasy, they start reading young adult novels. It is very interesting to watch that happen because all of a sudden they want more. I had a student, an AP student in every single class but English. And she came up to me and she said, Mrs. Burton, I really just don't like to read. And I thought about it and I said, why? And she said, I don't know why, but it's hard for me to read. And I wondered if she had some sort of dyslexia. And so I took her back and I said, look, this is a book, it's called Mouse. And it has pictures all the way through. And it's written for adults. Even though it looks like a comic book, it's written for adults. And I said, it won a Pulitzer, because this is a girl who obviously wants things that are going to stretch her. So she took Mouse home and she came back like the next day and she said, do you have more books like that? So I found Persepolis for her. So I started finding graphic novels. She came in after she'd read like 4 or 5 different books. I turned to her and I said, see, you're a reader. And she said, but this is just, I said, this isn't just anything. These are books that are written for and expected for adults to read. You are not reading dumbed down stuff. You're reading stuff that is for your age level and over. You're reading stuff that AP students should be reading. And it dawned on me that some of our students, number one, might have reading issues because of dyslexia. My oldest granddaughter has a tracking problem. You know how when you go to the doctor that they have you follow my granddaughter doesn't. Her eyes don't track well, and they've noticed that. And so she's had to do exercises to increase it. And there are other things too, children who've never been read to. When kids hit 3rd grade, all of a sudden teachers say, now you're going to text only. Some of those kids, 4 or 5 years before they started kindergarten, they were read to on a nightly basis. They are ready because they have that background. They have that experience. But then you have students who were never read to, not because their parents didn't love them, but because maybe their parents don't read, or because their parents are too busy working and they have a babysitter at night. Who knows why? But a lot of students, particularly in lower income families, do not have that opportunity to have that experience. So when all of a sudden picture books are taken away from them, they have not had that visual contact with what's written on the page. When it describes something, when it explains something, it's words. It's not visual to them. They don't see what it looks like. If you were read to and you saw the pictures, and if that happened to you on an extended period of time as a child, then you have that background. You have that visual context. When it says a red wagon, you picture a red wagon. But if you don't, that can make it difficult. Flashbacks are really hard for some of these students because they don't understand that it's going back in time and that it's picking something up that you need to know. Manga and other graphic novels visually show you it's going back in time. They visually show you it's a red wagon. And I really encouraged my students when I was in elementary school, the teachers, to let them at least choose one book that was totally their own choice. And for many of those students, that was a picture book for 4th and 5th grade students. And teachers would say, but Kate, and I'd say, I don't, let them choose a book that they can have fun with. We'll let them check out 2 books. They can have a book that you want and a book that I want. And what I want is for them to choose whatever they want. We have a tendency to just really try to dictate with kids. And that to me is part of this book banning. I don't know if you saw the recent articles talking about how some schools now are no longer able to use Shakespeare because of sexual context. I was reading that, it was either in the New York Times or the New Yorker. And for AP classes and stuff like that, they're taking excerpts that they feel are important that do not include, like from Romeo and Juliet, from Hamlet, from Macbeth. So they're not being exposed to things that are in their eyes sexually inappropriate for the kids. I'm saying Shakespeare? Really? I'm so frustrated by this group of people that seem to be able to think that they can tell people what they can and can't do. And the thing that is the most ironic is these are the people who are screaming for their own freedom. They're taking away our freedom and they're screaming for their own freedom. Well, how is that logical? It's really hard for me to understand this, like really, really hard for me to understand this. That was one of the reasons I think that doing this was important for me, was basically understanding exactly where I stood and how I would be able to deal with it personally. I wish it hadn't happened, but it was a positive experience. You do have to focus on what you really, got out of something. I'm the kind of person who says, okay, this is over with. What did I gain from it? What can I pull forward? What can I do now? And one thing I can do now is to make sure that my library continues to be a diverse and open library that reflects my entire student body and provides something for everybody.
A lot of the people are saying that they care about freedom. Like, that is a good thing too, if they're even willing to have the conversation, which not everybody is to be like, yeah, we care about freedom of speech, we care about freedom of choice. The library is large, you have options. And especially when you're talking about children, you can have that discussion with your own kids about why you think something is or is not appropriate. But we're not making that choice based on your kid for all kids. And I know some people are concerned about labeling books as being LGBTQ plus, even though that's so unfortunate because, like you were saying, it's so nice to have an experience where someone could immediately know where to go find those books if they want to go find those books. So
Students had asked for it. When students ask for something, I try. Years and years ago, I created I called it Street Colors, and it was all about any aspect of street and prison life. And so it included books that talked about gangs, that talked about drugs, talked about all kinds of street life. And I had it up for about 3 years. And then I thought, okay, we'll move on, put a different display up, and I'll just put those back on the shelf, and they'll have the little label on so they can find the books, because I put a little genre label on each one of them. And I set up a new display. And after it'd been sitting up for maybe 2 weeks, a group of 5 kids came up to me and said, we have a favor to ask. Will you put Street Colors up again? we
oh,
we don't want Street Colors to be mixed in with the rest of the books. We want it separate. So I pulled all the Street Color books back out, and we made up the display again. I've now changed it to urban fiction. I thought urban fiction was a better title for it. And I found this wonderful, I don't even know the group that it is, but it's a group poster. It shows like tenements, and it has people on top of the tenements. And there's this sense of intellectualism among the people who are kind of sprouting from the tenement buildings. But there's also this sense that they're bound to the tenement. And so I thought it was a really positive thing, because it shows these very intellectual looking young people who are stuck, who are trapped in something. And I thought it really gave a good vibe for the concept of urban fiction. I've tried really hard to make my library extremely inviting, because I want my students to understand that if it's something they want on my shelves, I will put it on my shelves. And it has been a little scary in my library, because I do have a large number of Russian, Eastern European students, and many of them are very strong evangelical Christians. On the other hand, and this is something that people don't think about from the group that were attacking me, 2 things that I have done. One, I knew a group of mothers wanted their daughters to have clean romance novels without any sex, just romance, because a lot of the Russian mothers want their daughters to marry soon after high school. Some of these bright Russian girls, just really, really bright, and they get married at 18. And by the time they're 25, they have 5 kids. To me, it's really sad, in my eyes, wasting a portion of their lives that they should have been exploring careers, professionalism, and then maybe, if it's a really important thing to get married, then have a family. But so it's very, very frustrating to see this, but they wanted clean romance novels for their daughters. So I made a huge display, and I made sure everything in there was appropriate for this population. And I called it Romance and Relationships. And we have a local Christian writer who has published and even had movies. She's a very popular Christian writer, and she does all kinds of romance and relationships. And she lived in our area, came and donated 30 books to this collection.
wow.
It was really cool. So I had this really nice, and also she gave me her email address. When kids emailed her, she sent them a free copy of one of her books. She was,
Wow.
yeah, it was really, really lovely. And so I had this huge display, and I did it really cute. I had romance and relationships, and the and was Cupid. in between that. So
Aw.
Cupid was in between the two. And I put little hearts, the little hearts that have the sayings on it, stickers of those.
Oh,
And so I put the little stickers, you forever, things like that.
yeah,
And
yeah.
kids loved it. The girls came in and they just loved it. And that was specifically for the population who are targeting me now. More recently, after the pandemic, I realized that a lot of kids had become depressed and discouraged. And I saw those Disney alternative fairy tale, the alternative to them, to the Disney movie. So like villain stories, or what if Anna and Elsa didn't ever meet? They separated them from birth and they never actually. So the books are based on something that these kids are familiar with, but it's a twist. I started buying those books and I found that there were girls who were really excited about reading those because they were discouraged, they were depressed. These books also appeal to this group of people because they're Disney, they're fairy tales. Of course, now even Disney is targeted, which amazed me that someone would actually target Disney at all. Disney goes against the don't say gay, and now Disney's a target. And then I found other twisted, rewritten fairy tales for this group of students again, because I knew that those were the kinds of things that this population. So it's not that I ignore that population, which is very frustrating to me. And in fact, two of the parents who wrote me said, you don't do this kind of thing for the other kids. And I wrote back, yes, I do. And I wrote back those two things. I said, these are two things that I have done in my library specifically for these populations to ensure their needs are being met. Neither of them answered me back. Maybe didn't even read what I said.
Right.
But I decided that I had to do that, to tell them what I was doing. But of course, I'm going to meet the needs of all my students. Why would I leave out those kids? And that's, I think, another thing that is very frustrating. Several people said, you librarians are only interested in the LGBT kids. No, you have targeted the LGBT kids, so that's all you see. If you target something and then we have to defend it, that's all you see of us. But that's certainly not all we are. And that was what was very frustrating to me, was I became limited to this group of people as a person who only supported LGBT kids, period. And to be totally honest, if they really even went further, they would be upset that I'm really aggressive about ensuring that my Black Lives Matter materials are very strong. I ensure that my cultural diversity is really, really strong. I do a really good display for Indigenous people. I try really hard to make sure my library really, really reflects the kinds of things that I want it to reflect. And yet I do, of course, include that population that targets me. But face it, they are in the minority. They really are in the minority. What's frustrating is I think of the number of people who, and they didn't even vote to pass our levy. They voted against our levy, but it's still passed by a majority, which means that the majority of people feel that my library is fine. That was very upsetting to me to know that these people really discounted the fact that I actually work for their children too, and that I really do care about their children. And I think that's another aspect that librarians need to focus on. I wish the initial statement that I wrote back, that I had encouraged the superintendent to include something that said, we attempt to include materials for all students, including yours. My own parents were extremely conservative, and I doubt they would ever go to a school and say, remove books. They may say to me, like my mother, you were talking about how this encourages kids to read more. When I was a teenager, my mother said that the dirtiest book she'd ever read was Lady Chatterley's Lover. Guess what the next book was I checked out of the library, because I had to see what my mother thought was a dirty book.
Yeah.
It begets itself. I mean, the thing is, and my sister evidently did the exact same thing. It is something that these people need to realize, that once you say something like that, it becomes this forbidden fruit that is so tempting, and it's something that you want to be aware of. That's kind of where I am with things. I love life. I love my kids. I feel like I'm just in a perfect place, doing what I want to do and enjoying my life. I'm just really glad that it played out correctly. I am a little nervous because my principal could actually severely cut my budget this year because he doesn't feel I do a good job choosing books. I don't know if he will do that or not. I hope not. I hope he realizes that the LGBTQ books are actually a very small portion of the money I spend my budget on, but I will continue to spend it on that, because I do still have that population, and I still will want to ensure that their needs are met. I mean, some people say, well, look at all those books you have. If they think that I overrepresent LGBT books, I have about 21,000 books in my library, and maybe 150 of them are specifically LGBT. What percentage is that? It's less than 1%. Consequently, I don't think anybody can target that. If they do, they're targeting something ridiculously. It's a ridiculous idea. And I'm hoping that that's how this plays out, that they realize that this is what I'm doing. However, one of the things that was very nice, a lot of people made the comment in the meeting, could we have something that is less out there? You know what I mean? Now, I don't like whitewashing. Genderqueer is like, at the very, very far edge of what we want. Couldn't you maybe just pull it back a little? And I said, no, I'm not going to pull it back a little because I don't see a reason to pull it back a little. However, because of that, I did realize that the majority of people, even the most conservative that were in the educational realm, did want some LGBT books in the library. I can't remember anybody who said we shouldn't have any. And not a single teacher actually said I should pull the books. However, there were 3 teachers I do know felt that I should pull the book. But I just knew they felt that way. I mean, they never actually told me to, they never actually said to. But I had a woman come in and she said, now, Kate, you don't really put things in the library that groom our kids, will you? And I thought, no, I don't. Because this isn't grooming our kids. Those were the kinds of things that were difficult when I was an educator or a teacher, and somebody that I worked closely with and I'd enjoyed working with, who all of a sudden I realized really wasn't, just on board with me and considered potentially that my choices were immoral. I think it's immoral not to include these books on the shelves, and morality should have nothing to do with sex. Morality should have to do with how you treat other people, how you consider the entire population you work with. And I believe in inclusion. I don't believe in excluding anybody. I think that's the bottom line.
Since you're a school librarian, I'm not sure if this would be as relevant, but have you noticed any difference in online presence? You said you got some negative emails previously.
After the final decision was made, I still got some hate emails, some negative emails saying we can't believe you're keeping it in the library and that the district has approved it. The district sent out that it was being kept in the library and that the district had put it through the complete challenge process and that they had decided to retain it in the library. And the people who put the challenge forth were notified. That was they didn't put it out to the whole public. They just sent it out to the people who were challenged. And I did receive maybe between 8 and 10 responses telling me how awful I was, and I could still take it out of the library, and where's your moral compass type stuff. Why do you believe that this should be in the library? Things like, and so you're going to continue to groom our kids. But then it died out. It fairly quickly died out after that. And I just didn't respond to anybody because my feeling was at that point, we'd made the decision and we told them what the decision was. And that was it. It was done. Something that was very interesting, which I haven't mentioned, and somebody mentioned in the meeting, we have this lovely tech man who's just fabulous in our district. A lot of us really enjoy, and he's very bright and very talented. And he comes up and he says, I don't know why you guys haven't thought of this. He said, but all of our students have access to the public library at school because we have that connection for secondary schools to be able to use everything digital in school. All they have to do is put in our zip code and their ID number as their ID, and then they put in the date of their birth, and it automatically lets them into the public library digital system so they can do everything with it. So they don't even need a library card. They automatically have a digital library card if they are a secondary student. And he said, Kate can't have the book on the shelves, but a student can sit in her library and open it up and read it from the public library because that digital presence. And the thing that several people made the comment to, our students are looking at and engaging in so much more risky and things that are much more far out than genderqueer ever has been. And yet genderqueer, which actually has a message, being pulled. They're saying that genderqueer isn't appropriate. But think of the things that your kids are going to. I tried to raise my children fairly conservatively. I was very open to what they were reading and everything. And I wanted them to respect everybody. I wanted them to respect any kind of person, but I also wanted them to have a fairly innocent childhood. So when my daughter was 13, she and her friends, 3 or 4 of her friends, they had a slumber party and they shot nude pictures of themselves.
Oh my God.
A boy at school got a hold of one of the girls' pictures.
Oh my gosh.
And he told her he would give it back to her if she gave him a blowjob, or if not, he'd show the picture to other boys. So she, of course, was humiliated and she didn't know what to do. And not only that, she was 13 and she really didn't know what a blowjob was. Okay. Because when you're 13, you know what I mean? So this girl was born in 1980. So years ago, this is before 2000. Okay. So this is a 13-year-old girl back then. This is 30 years ago that she was talking to me because she's 43 now. She said, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, number one, you've got to tell your parents. But number two, they didn't really understand what it was. And so I told the three of them, I said, well, this is actually what it is. And I said, and this is why you have to tell your parents. And I said, this boy could abuse that. He could have other copies of this. He could force you to do this over and over again. I said, this isn't something you want to have happen. And they were totally grossed out by what it was. You know, it's really, really gross to the three of them. They're like, oh. But it dawned on me that if a girl saw the picture, see that there's two pictures in Genderqueer, actually fairly unappealing of a blowjob. They're drawn, you know, they're kind of crudely drawing cartoons, basically showing you what it is and what they, you know, Maya Kobabe experienced when they were growing up, you know, and what they felt was an appropriate part of their societal norms. Looking at them, I remember thinking, this is not tantalizing. This is not titillating. This is basically saying, this is what I did. And this is why I didn't want to do it anymore. You know, and this is why it dawned on me that I didn't have to do it and I could still be considered normal. Immediately when I read that, I remembered the conversation that I'd had with my daughter and her friends. And I remember thinking, gosh, you know, there are a lot of boys, and today, I mean, it's, you know, if that was happening in middle school, who knows, you know what I mean? The other thing that I didn't bring to light, but I found out afterwards, I have a friend who's a librarian over in Portland, and she had genderqueer in her library, and she emailed me back and she said, I looked at the district library. She said, there are 9 high schools in Portland and 8 of the 9 have genderqueer, and 1 of the middle schools has genderqueer. Public schools can sometimes be pretty narrow in what they will accept in libraries or in curriculum. We've had to become a lot more aggressive in our stance with what we feel should be in our libraries. The high school librarians as a group were very pleased when they let us go through the process and they didn't take it out. Something that did happen to me years ago, I had Rosario plus Vampire in my library, which is a graphic novel. I ordered more of it because it was really popular. I was very excited because there were 2 twins who came in who read it all the time, and they were excited that I was going to get more of it. And I said, oh yeah, I'm getting the rest of it. And they said, oh, our mom's going to really enjoy it. We're reading it at home with our mom. And they had a single parent mother, these 3 girls, twins and an older sister. And they were very excited that we were going to get them. I ordered them through my office, but they went to the district, and the purchasing department at the district decided they were inappropriate.
Oh.
And my principal was horrified by the, you know, the sexual aspect. There wasn't any sex in it. It's just, you know, the sexually provocatively dressed, you know, the big breasts, the skimpy skirts and kind of hinting around things. But there was nothing actually, in my eyes, in any way inappropriate with the books. And all they saw was the packaging. They didn't even see the books. Okay. They saw the packaging and they decided from the packaging. And my principal decided from the packaging. And my principal said, you will remove it from the shelves. In fact, she came in and she took it off the shelves. And I said, I don't think you can do that. I said, there's stuff in place. I was bullied by another librarian in the district. He told me that I would be viewed as unprofessional, that I would lose my standing in the district. I could potentially even lose my job. No one supported me, not even the union. Nobody supported me in keeping it in the library. It was extremely stressful. And finally, I ended up taking it off the shelf. But what was really disheartening was when this poor girl comes back and finds out that I'm not going to have it. She's been talking this up at home with her mom and her sisters, and now I'm not going to have it. Her mother, this was a single parent with 3 girls. Her mother saved enough money so they could buy it. They should have had the copies that I bought at their house. And the librarian who bullied me said, are you going to fall on your sword for some dumb manga? It had been checked out over 50 times, by the way, the copies that I had. I am going to fall on my sword for the 50 students who checked the book out already. I am going to fall on my sword for access. This has nothing to do with the specific title, the specific level. This has to do with what our students are going to be able to access. And you have denied access. You are banning a book. Oh no, he said, we're just removing it from the shelves. That's the definition of banning.
Yeah.
He doesn't work for the district anymore, but his wife does. And I said, tell your husband about this, about genderqueer, because I said, let me tell you right now, genderqueer and Rosario Vampire are on totally different league. Because of that situation, when I drove home after that, I thought, I'm going to figure something out if this ever happens again. I am never going to take a book off my shelf again unless the district forces me to. My principal wanted me to look through the entire manga collection for anything that showed any kind of risque behavior. Period. And I said, well, do you want me to look at the art collection too? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, we have a lot of nudes in the art collection. Do you want me to pull all of those? And she said, Kate, I think you're pulling this out of proportion. I said, I don't. I think you are. That's the problem. I think you are pulling this out of proportion. This book has been checked out 50 times. No one who actually has been reading the book has objected to it. Some people in district who aren't even related to this situation want us to remove it, and you're telling me I have to. It's very frustrating. I will say one of the group of people who were the most adverse to it were white men. White males, for some reason, are extremely frightened of almost any gender identity difference. It is very frustrating to me to have this oppositional group of people. And because I'm a woman, I'm looked at as, well, this is this contrary person. And I think that's another part of it. The stereotype of a librarian has become that we're these bitches that want our own way, as opposed to being people who are caring and concerned about a population and want to ensure that they are valued and that their rights are protected. That's a real frustrating thing to me, because a lot of school librarians in particular are women, and yet they have this sense sometimes of having no power. Their power is extremely limited. And a librarian should have autonomy in their own library. And the community should be what rules the library, not an individual, not a group of parents, but the entire community needs. And not even me. I shouldn't rule what's in the library. Something that dawned on me when I read the book first time. I read it 3 times to make sure that I have exactly what I had to respond and to talk to people. I wanted to make sure I felt really comfortable with the book before the process moved on, when I realized this was going to happen. And the very first time I read it, as a 72-year-old woman, I hadn't read anything quite that provocative. It was startling. And it dawned on me that had I read it, had I done what my superintendent wanted me to have done, I'm not positive I would have still bought it. I hope I would have, but I'm not positive. I'll be totally honest with you. I'm not positive I would have bought it. However, by the time I was reading it the 3rd time through, and I really felt the message very strongly, I was really glad I had included it in the library. And that was when it dawned on me that my own prejudices, me as a person, should not inhibit the kinds of things I put in the library. I don't want to taint my own library. Librarians really need to think about that as they're purchasing. How much of subjectivity is going into your choice? How much of you is going into your choice? You shouldn't allow yourself to make that library. That was another huge wake up from this, was that I have a sense that it's my library, but it's not my library. It's the community library. And I have responsibility of acknowledging and honoring that community. And if I don't, then I'm really not a very good librarian. There's a librarian over in our neighboring school district, a more conservative school district, and she refused to purchase Harry Potter for her elementary school library. I find that to be absolutely awful. It's one thing for your parents to say, you can't read Harry Potter. It's another thing for your parents to say, the entire school. For that librarian to take away that opportunity to that many children was wrong. That was just totally wrong. She inserted her own opinion much too strongly. But that's basically where I stand.
No, it's not a book, but I think there's a show called Sex Education on Netflix. It's basically about the son of like a sex therapist who accidentally becomes the school sex therapist, even though he's never had sex before. And because he absorbed all of this stuff just from being with his mom, But I like it because it's like unsexy, but it's about sex. It takes place in England, but it could take place anywhere because just a lot of people don't want to have these conversations with their teenagers. And then teenagers are just trying to figure stuff out and they can't talk to their parents about it, or they don't know who to talk to about it. And so it's almost like confession in the show. Like they go into a bathroom stall and then he's on the other bathroom stall and they can have advice about looking at him. So I think just about like having written materials that are age appropriate and talk about things that they're not able to ask most of the time seems like a no-brainer when you consider all of the much more explicit content they could find online that is not going to be accurate or age appropriate.
Or given in context.
Yes, right.
Context is so important. And that's the wonderful thing about genderqueer, is placed in a specific context that makes it extremely relevant. What these kids are seeing online through Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and things like that, those are oftentimes taken completely out of context. The students have no way of putting a filter on that to understand it through their own lens. It's just bombarding them, and it's very difficult for them to navigate it. That's why we have to have some of the books that we have in the libraries to help students actually navigate what they're seeing and what their experiences as they grow up. Because like you said, Many of them are afraid to ask their parents what it is. When I turned about 11 years old, my mother handed me a book about menstrual periods. She said, if you have any questions, look in the book, because she didn't want to talk about it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So I had this little book that explained it all to me. And she said, now, aren't they giving you classes in school about this? You know, basically, I got married when I was 25. And the night before I got married, my mother all of a sudden realized she had never talked to me about sex. And she said, now, I don't know if you know what your husband, and I turned to her and I said, Mom, we're not having a conversation. I'm 25. I really have a good idea what's going to happen. Don't
Oh
worry
no.
about it. But it was
Yeah.
it was embarrassing to me that my mother would think that at 25, I hadn't tried during that time period to figure things out. And that to me shows me how many probably of these parents are with their kids. And I don't know what your church experience was, but in the Mormon church, let me tell you, some of the things they tell you are so, when a girl gets married in the Mormon church, basically at that point in time, she probably is not supposed to have done much more than kiss, held hands, and hug the guy. And then all of a sudden, whammo, the night of the thing is everything
Yeah.
under the sun, from nothing to everything under the sun. And so for some girls, I think it's a huge shock, because it's almost like, well, it's like being raped. And so when I talked to my sons, one of the things I told my sons was, number one, you get a girl pregnant and mom will be on your tail until that kid turns 18. And number two,
Mhm.
when you have sex, if the girl doesn't enjoy it as much as you do, you did something wrong. You made a mistake and you need to fix that. And I said, that's it. And always wear a condom so that mom doesn't have to hound you about a baby. And those were the kinds of things I told my sons. And I told my daughter, value yourself. Don't let a boy disvalue you. That's number one. And number two, you don't ever have to feel you have to do anything with a boy. Whatever you do with a boy is totally your choice, totally your decision. You can say yes to anything and you can say no to anything. And never say yes because you feel you have to. Only do what you want to do. Only do something that is going to be good for you. Period. And I think those are the kinds of discussions that parents need to have with their kids, but a lot of parents don't have those kinds of discussions with their kids. You don't know how grateful I was when my son came home. He was staying with a group of guys. They weren't his roommates, thank goodness. He was staying with a group of guys for a couple of nights. They were friends. And this girl was over there just goofing around with them. And she said, I did all this. She said, could I just take a shower? And the guy said, yeah, if you'll sleep with me. And my son came home and he said, Mom, can you believe that that's what he said to her? And I realized I'd raised him right. He said, I lost total respect. He said, he's no longer my friend. He said, I could not believe that he treated her that way. That to me actually is almost the more important, is boys being taught how to respect a girl and how to let a girl know that she's valued and that she's important to you, and that whatever you do between the two of you is mutual and it's between both of you. It's not what you want, it's what you both want. And if it's not what you both want, then it's inappropriate. That's a hard thing.
I mean, nobody likes having awkward conversations, but it's
Because I felt comfortable saying
yeah.
what I said to you. I tried to make it something where we both felt comfortable, but
Yes.
where they understood exactly what I meant, where they
Yes.
understood and they realized that the other person was important,
Mhm.
as important as they were. Because I think a
Mhm.
lot of boys don't think of the girl as important. She's an object sometimes, or she is a challenge, a notch, and those kinds of things shouldn't exist.
I think that's part of the discussion around gender and sexuality anyway. If you make it seem like boys are a completely different planet from girls, and we'll never understand girls or whatever, then they treat them like aliens because they don't treat them like people, instead of like, we are people and we all get our feelings hurt. We all need to consider each other. We all need to XYZ. It's not a secret code that you have to hack to make the girl like you or the other way around. But it feels like aliens sometimes, the way that we grew up being talked about the opposite sex or whatever. And that's, I think, where it can be easy to take away like agency or humanity from even your crushes, because you just don't know just the way they've been talked about before.
And because of it, the language and the context can really skew your social value. And it used to be long time ago when I was young. I mean, this really was a long time ago. When my sister graduated from high school in 1967, her best friend had become pregnant. Her best friend was a total AP student and was absolutely brilliant. And her father was a professor at Cal Berkeley. And so this really, really talented girl, but she was now pregnant, and she married him and stayed with him, and she miscarried the child, but they stayed married because it was obvious that they'd had sex. And then they did have 2 children later. And I imagine it was a pretty unpleasant marriage because she was brilliant. Like I said, all AP classes. And this is a boy who I don't even know for sure if he graduated from high school. And yet she could have probably gone to one of the Ivy League schools. That's hard.
Yeah, I think of like some people my dad knew growing up who got girls pregnant when they were 15 or whatever, and they had to get married, and everyone's being punished in the situation because they're just kids, you know.
Let me tell you one other thing. It was so bad. My sister was maid of honor, and her parents were stunned that my parents would allow it because of the situation, that my sister would align herself with someone who was a slut. And I
Wow.
remember thinking her own parents felt that there was something wrong with her and something horrible had happened. I felt so, so sorry for this friend of my sister's. It was just awful. I just remember thinking, this is terrible that people are treating her like this. In some respects, it's gotten a lot better because now there's not as much stigma about it. We are moving forward in that respect, but we're not moving far enough forward, like we're talking about with LGBTQ, with things that people consider unconventional. I really liked how Pete Buttigieg's partner said, so what happens when our twins start school in kindergarten? They say, well, what are your parents like? And they talk about their 2 dads. Are they not supposed to talk about their 2 dads? Are they supposed to say, oh, well, we don't talk about our family life? Is that something that becomes inappropriate? That is something that I really, really liked. I also liked the concept with late term abortion that he mentioned. That is dear to my heart because there are people I've known who've had to have late term abortions for various reasons. And at that point in time, they've probably bought a crib, considered names, and they are definitely planning on having that child. And then for some reason, one reason or another, they are forced to make a decision because of medical concerns. And now they're being told that they only have one option, that it could potentially jeopardize the life of the mother, that the baby probably is not going to live, and that the mother now could possibly die too. And I really loved the way he put it, because how many people the last few months of pregnancy want an abortion?
Right.
Almost none. So you actually are putting a person in a position who is already in a tragedy in yet another tragedy. And I think that's where society, like it comes with banned books, we're taking situations and we're just not paying attention to what needs to happen. I'm so angry with these people. What's really awful and what really bothers me almost the most is the fact that these people will not listen to anything. I try to listen to them. I try to make sure that their needs are being met, but they won't pay attention to the other side. I want to have clean romances in my library. I want to take care of everybody. Do you know what I mean? Everybody is important to me, but I don't see that coming from the other side. I don't see that kind of empathy, that kind of caring, and that's one of the things that bothers me the most. This group of people call themselves Christians, and they seem to be totally uncaring. That was part of what happened with this. I remember people saying that Christ would stomp all over me. I thought, no, Christ wouldn't stomp all over me. Christ loves these people. Christ loves everyone. Get a clue. What church do you go to on Sunday? What do they preach? Those are the kinds of things that are frustrating to me. But when I was growing up, 2 of the boys in our congregation went on missions. And while they were on their missions, realized that they were gay and realized that it was potentially inappropriate for them to be with male missionaries all the time and that they really probably should go home. So they went to their mission presidents and said, I'm gay. I don't feel comfortable on my mission. I need to come home. So 2 of the men in my ward came home from their missions, and we all knew why they came home. And these were cherished young men. I mean, heck, I had a crush on one of them. I mean, they were just nice, just lovely people. Anyway, so these 2 guys come home. Both of them go through some kind of aversion therapy to get the gay out, because that's what the church recommends them to do. After the first time, one of the boys commits suicide. Yes, one of them commits suicide because it didn't take. He's desperate. He doesn't know what to do. His mother, who's a total jerk, not my mother's friend, basically disowns him and tells him he's filth. The other boy, his family is relatively supportive, but the church, of course, in that time period was totally unsupportive. So he goes through a second aversion therapy because it's a different method. No one should have to go through that. That's why we have books like this. Everyone should recognize that this is who the person is. This isn't something you can change. This is how God made that person, and this is someone we need to love and we need to accept and make part of our community. There's nothing wrong with this person. There's nothing evil. There's nothing sinful. There's nothing wrong. But knowing 2 young men who my ward cherished, who I thought of as wonderful people, knowing that they were mistreated like this and knowing that their lives became so tragic helped my mother better understand. So she was very frustrated. See, my father's attitude was about any gay male person that was castrate or kill.
Wow.
I mean, that was his attitude. And my mother was not that way at all. My mom said, well, what about Carl? And what about Richard? What about these two boys that we loved? And not only that, two boys who felt so bad about being gay. Why would they try so hard if they really weren't gay? Why would they need to do something like that if they really weren't that way? My mother was very startled by the whole thing. And so she was much more open and much more caring. That was my first encounter that kind of changed my feeling about it, was when I found out about these two men that I really admired and I knew wouldn't lie. And it dawned on me that they really were gay and that I had to be accepting of this. Sometimes you need to have your paradigm shifted so that you understand. And I hope that as more and more of society is introduced and becomes aware of people that they love who are in these situations, if it's your son, if it's your daughter, it's much more likely that you'll be able to actually, hopefully, accept that and move forward and say, gosh, this is who this person is. And that's why we want these books. That's another reason, because these books should be a part of the collection, because we value these kids. We value who they are. We value that this is who they are. And they're us. That's the thing. I hate the them and us. They're us. We're all us. There's no them. There's just us. And that's what I think is super important, is for us to realize that we're all us and that we're all different. We all do different things. We all are, you know what I mean? And that's who we are. We're us.
I think of as well, when people say, oh, they're trying to get attention, or they're trying to do this or that. And if you think about the majority of attention, especially in a school environment where kids don't want to be looked at half of the time, are people going to really put themselves in a place that could get them bullied or worse for that's a very strong lifestyle change to make for attention.
Exactly.
Nobody realistically, if they were to consider it, would think that, especially I feel like a man would transition knowing what could happen to them, especially based on the level of hatred that there is out there. Same with the gay missionaries, in the different ways, they turn to who they hoped would help them, and that's it's really discouraging for sure. Because I feel like in some ways culture is so much more open. I'm bisexual, so when I came out to my parents a few years ago, I feel like in 2017, 18, it's a lot easier than in 2007, 2008, which is a lot easier than, it gets better in a lot of ways. And on top of that, even though my parents, who are very conservative in a lot of ways, don't really understand the concept, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to them, they have seen what has happened to their friends who have reacted badly to their kids coming out, and how they sometimes become estranged to their adult kids, and that's not worth it to them to have so they're like, I don't get it, but I'm not going to overreact about it. My confusion about this is not worth losing a relationship, so we'll try to talk about it. And it doesn't mean that it's always easy to talk about it, and it often isn't easy to talk about it, but we're kind of at almost like a stalemate of being like, well, neither of us actually wants to ruin the relationship, so we have to kind of understand each other.
That's what we need to find more in society, is people who maybe don't understand but accept. You don't have to understand to say, I don't understand that, but it's okay. I am definitely heterosexual. I will never know what it feels like to be something else. However, does that mean that I don't accept it? Does that mean that I say, oh, well, you're not like me, so forget you? No, that's a pretty poor ass way of looking at something. But looking at something and saying, gosh, you're different. That's cool. And I like you because of your differences, because that's a positive move forward in my eyes. That means that society becomes more inclusive, society becomes more open for everybody. By the way, something I keep meaning to say, and it's totally changing the subject, the way you've done your hair is really cool. I'm sorry you couldn't read fantasy, because I'm sure you really like fantasy, because your hair looks like fantasy.
I definitely did anyway. And it did become eventually my mom found out I'd been reading Harry Potter to my brothers out loud.
Oh, I love it.
So that was a big day. It was not good. But obviously in retrospect, they're it wasn't that big of a deal. It's just a lot of, stuff that was going on in the culture, culture at the time. And now J.K. Rowling, I have issues with J.K. Rowling that are completely separate from fantasy now.
Yes.
You know, I also have had a best friend who her parents have just completely cut contact with her
Oh my.
over assuming that she's a lesbian. Like, they didn't even have the discussion. And, so I know there's a huge range of what people are willing to talk about and not willing to talk about even today. I think just any sort of way to humanize people and our lives and to talk, like, even like the show Queer Eye, for example. Like, some people think Queer Eye is really whatever, like, not everybody likes it, but there's so much to say for people who have never, at least knowingly, met queer people,
Mhm.
having actual talks with them, being like, oh, this isn't that strange, or this isn't that evil, or whatever they've heard growing up. Not everyone feels comfortable having those conversations with people that they assume might hate them. But when you can have that middle ground conversation, obviously it's a valuable thing.
As people are introduced more and who have that kind of relationship with people in their community, with people in their family, I'm hoping that as each generation moves up, that it slowly becomes a situation where there is no difference. Nobody looks and says, gosh, this person is this way or this person is that way. But it's everybody is valued and everybody is part of our community. And I don't even know if these people care that much about the books or anything. I think it's just actually more of a us and them.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? You have this in your library, it's something I can complain about, so I'm going to. We're going to hash this out. We're going to push you and push you and push you and goad you and push you and push you and goad you. Why? That's something that's very frustrating to me, is where's this coming from? As we allow anything, it will just continue to escalate. I see it happening all over the place. When I saw the Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth and Hamlet thing, where there are some schools who are just going to do portions of it for their AP classes because they don't want them to read the whole book. Is that stupid or what? I mean, I really don't get it. I mean, I showed Romeo and Juliet. I showed both the original from when I was a kid and the contemporary one. We watched the Zeffirelli as we were reading the book so we could see it in a traditional format.
Yeah.
And then as a gift at the end, we watched the Baz Luhrmann to see the slick modern one. And then we also, and see, I did something, and no parents actually said anything about this, which was really startling to me. I did a whole unit on suicide. And we looked at Romeo and Juliet through a suicide lens to see if we could see the kinds of markers for suicide in teens. And we discussed that in class. And I thought parents would actually complain about that, but no one did. The only complaint I got about Romeo and Juliet was from one of my students. And he was just the nicest kid. And I really, really liked him a lot. We started by reading the book about having a crush. Before we read Romeo and Juliet, we read a short story about a crush. And then I was going to start into it. And when we finished the book about the crush, he raised his hand. He said, Mrs. Burton, I really want to talk to the class. And I said, okay, you can come up and talk to the class. And he said, you do realize, class, none of us should be dating at this point in time. We are only ninth graders. We are only 14 years old. You should never date before you turn 16 years old. I was stunned that a young man would have that kind of courage to say that in front of a group of high school students and risk being taunted from this very conservative Russian, very evangelical family. Just the nicest kid. I really did enjoy him tremendously. He wasn't allowed to watch movies, but he filmed all the games. And I said, do you watch the films that you film when you film the games? And he said, that's documentary. He said, I can't watch things that are pretend. He said, if it's real, I can watch it. But if it's in the movie theater, I can't.
Whoa.
In other words, it's okay if I watch something that's really happening in front of me, as a game or something like that. But no, I can't watch anything that could be pretend or could be, you know what I mean? I've seen a lot of different positions that parents have taken on things. And that was another reason why I became so involved as a librarian. When I first became a librarian, I realized that I did have a huge, diverse pool of students that I needed to, figure out and understand better. I've made some, I shouldn't say concessions, but I've made the effort to ensure that everyone is really included. And then to be accused of doing something wrong has been very frustrating.
The only other question would be if you have any advice for if any other school librarian was to face something similar, if you had any advice for that.
Probably the most important piece of advice is to find support. Also, the American Library Association, they have the Office of Intellectual Freedom. Using the Office of Intellectual Freedom is critical. They will give you a whole bunch of help. PEN America is another one too. PEN America is an organization that tracks banned books and challenges. I let both the Office of Intellectual Freedom and Pan America know about the challenge. And then when I was able to keep the book in the library, I let them know that the book was remaining in my library because I felt that was an important step. Also, to let particularly school librarians know, when I reported this to the Office of Intellectual Freedom, a couple of people said, why would you do that? I'm nationally board certified. And when you become nationally board certified as a librarian, one of the things you have to do is go through the challenge process. And one of the things that is included in that is to immediately contact the Office of Intellectual Freedom. So that was actually part of my national board certification process, recognizing that there was a source of help from the American Library Association. So understanding that, I think, is really critical, that there is a place you can go for help. The other thing is, if it happens all of a sudden and you're stuck with it, ask your school district what their protocol is. Don't just listen to what they say. Say, I want to know what the protocol for, because I wish I had done that the first time. If I'd known there was a protocol the first time, I think there would have been potentially a different outcome. I would have done something different. And I didn't. And that was dumb of me. I feel bad that I made that mistake. And if you haven't been ever challenged and you're thinking that it might occur, find out if your school district has some sort of challenge policy. Find out what protocol you go through. Do they have a collection development policy? See, that was the one thing about genderqueer. I did nothing wrong with when I purchased genderqueer. They recommended that we look at school library journal, book list, and the different ALA awards. Genderqueer got a starred review from School Library Journal and was one of their summer recommended reading choices. It won an Alex Award from the American Library Association. It was an honorable mention as one of the Stonewall Awards, and Booklist recommended it for high school students. So having those kinds of things and being able to say to my district, I used your collection development policy to purchase this book. Find out what the collection development policy is. Find out how your choice of book, if it's being challenged, how it fits in with that collection development policy. Find a way to justify your selection through the collection development policy. And that was something that I felt was really helpful with my situation. I said that multiple times to the superintendent, 3 times. And all 3 times he said, yes, but you should have gone further with this particular choice. And I was able to actually say to him, okay, right now over 2,000 books have come to question in the United States. At that point in time, this was not the most challenged book in the United States. Am I supposed to do that with every book that's challenged? He felt that I should have read it. I said, do you know how many books I have in my library that have been challenged? Probably my entire LGBT display has been challenged at one time or another. And so I think being able to say to a principal or a superintendent, I followed the directions that the district set out is really, really positive. And even if they do eventually ban the book and take the book off the shelves, you are covering yourself. You are saying to them, I used your policy. I did what you told me to do for this job. Please do not consider me derelict. I did nothing wrong. I think that was another critical thing that was helpful for me. Also, reach out with your staff. Find out which teachers support you. Find out if there's people in the district that support you, other librarians in the district who want to support you. If you feel comfortable going to your public library, try to get their support. Local bookstores oftentimes will support you because they don't want to be attacked by these people and they want that community to be strong. So I'd say those are some of the things to strengthen you. And also, whenever you read one of those negative emails, remember that you are putting yourself on the front line to protect your students. This is something that's extremely important because they are being attacked the same way you are. The feelings that you are feeling are the feelings that they are feeling. Those, to me, are some of the most important things for librarians in any setting, in any situation, to remember, because I think those do help you. They helped me be more strong. They help me feel more solid in my decision. And when you feel more solid in your decision, it's much more easy to say to someone, no, I'm not going to take that off my shelf. No, what you're telling me is not the best thing to do. And being able to say that that's not the right thing to do. That's not the best thing to do. In education, best practices is huge. Everything best practice. And I said, that's not best practice. Removing that from yourself is not best practice. And try to find the most academic language you can when you try to defend yourself, because that also, you want to have that erudite sense to your speech when you're talking to people. And that helps give you a lot more credibility. And then after it's over with, if you see holes in either your collection development policy or the protocol for selection, look at that. Try to get your district to eliminate those holes, the things that maybe bogged you down, the things that made it difficult, either for the challenge process or that are lacking maybe in the collection development policy. and to make sure that those things are strengthened. And maybe even as a library group, either as a public library, because a lot of public library systems include a lot more than one librarian, maybe several librarians, or in a school district where there are several librarians. See if you can group together as a group and become more solid and unified in your response to a challenge. If the whole group is unified in the response, you're going to find that that community won't have, you're bringing an army that's just as strong or stronger than theirs. And that, I think, is another critical element, is to say, look, all of us are united against this, and so you're not going to succeed. And I think those are the best, to me, those are the best thing to do.
I was just speaking to somebody who works with ALA yesterday, and he was saying that 2 states have left or are trying to leave ALA, which tells you what's going on, even in library organizations. So he was saying, like, it doesn't matter if your state has left ALA. If you have an issue, we will still help you. Like, it's not, you don't have to be part. I mean, it would be nicer for you to be part of ALA, but like, obviously there's a lot of politics going on, even inside libraries sometimes,
Years ago, when Michelle Alexander wrote The New Jim Crow, all about things like the school to prison pipeline and things like that for young Black males and young Black people, it's talking about how Jim Crow laws have not gone away. They have just changed. They're just camouflaged. And mainly they're camouflaged in prison. So that slavery does, in a sense, exist, but it exists through prisons, not through buying and selling of people. And so I bought The New Jim Crow for my library because I thought it was a really outstanding choice to put in my library. And I recommended it to high school librarians in my state. I got a letter back from a woman who said, I hope you put the opposing view out. And I remember thinking, okay, there is no valid opposing view to slavery, to mistreatment of people. What you're asking for doesn't exist. I felt like writing her back saying, okay, so I put out Ku Klux Klan literature. What are we talking about here? This is a librarian who wrote me back and questioned. This was in my own state. And something people do not realize, just because you're in a blue state doesn't mean you don't have those challenges. When the mask initiative came, kids had to wear masks to school when we first came back after the lockdown. One of our high schools, they, of course, demanded that kids wear masks. A group of Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups went to the school, and the police had to come and disband them and remove them because they were saying that these kids should be able to come in without masks. So those groups do exist. And when I received emails, 2 of the emails I received, I don't remember the specific names on the emails, but they indicated to me that they were potentially Proud Boys. So I received emails from 2 potentially Proud Boy members. So my area does have, even though I'm in a blue state, there are pockets of Washington state that are extremely conservative. I don't think I've mentioned this. All of the secondary librarians, as far as I know, supported me keeping genderqueer or supported keeping LGBTQ books in my library. I know of at least 2, and probably there are more, of the elementary librarians who did not support it. They never vocally said they didn't support it, but I could tell from their posturing in our meetings that they did not support me keeping it. So I do know, I'm well aware that there are librarians who don't support this.
Yeah, I'm also in a very conservative area in a blue state, so I understand.
I think that's something people don't see. When I posted things, I've said that I live in a conservative area, but I'm in a blue state. But like I said, looking around and trying to find people who support you, looking around trying to find people who will, buoy you up, because there are times when the teacher across the hall from me who's gay asked all of her friends to write me emails. You do not know how lovely it was to all of a sudden get emails saying, we are so proud of you. You're doing such a good job. Thank you for supporting us. It was so positive and so meaningful. Or the other teacher who brought me chocolate chip cookies to say thank you. Or the teacher who recommended me with the duck and said, we're so pleased that you're representing and taking care of our students for us. Those kinds of things made me feel so much more empowered. And part of that was because I actually went out and tried to recruit a group of people who would be supportive, so that I did feel that kind of support. finding people to support you is really critical, I think, in this, because if not, and I don't care how conservative an area you're in, there will always be people in that area that will potentially support you. You always can find somebody to support you. And that's one of the things to consider. And oftentimes, I will say this again, local bookstores, local bookstores are usually very willing to support. Boy, the bookstore that I go to, you cannot believe they were, and these were women who were my age. The women who run my bookstore are women my age, and they were so supportive of me. It was just, I was just, it was lovely. I just, to go in there and have them say, "You're our hero," And I think that's something that people who are doing this need to hear is, you're our hero. You're the person who's taking care of everybody. You're the person who's doing the right thing. And so I hope that any librarian who's faced with this finds people who can do that for them, because they really need that. It is hard. And it is frustrating to have people write and say unkind things to you, and to get email after email that says you're awful. So that would be my advice.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for talking with me for all of this time. It's been really nice to hear your perspective and to have an actual dialogue for a while with you about this.
You have been lovely, Lauren.